are going to be trimming up the different sections of the Folded in Love quilt today. The quilt, as you probably know by this point in the process, is pretty easy to put together. The only real tricky parts are the trimming steps, so I thought it would be helpful to put together a little bit of a video to show you how to do each part. I'd like to say, starting off, that I highly recommend you make sure your sections are well pressed before you trim. It will really help to increase the accuracy, and the more accurately you trim, the better your final quilt will look. So I'm using the throw as the example here. This is section A, it's turned sideways. It's gonna look, like this. It's obviously upside down to you, but that's the top of the section and the bottom of the section's down here. As the pattern shows, you're basically gonna cut, an angle that goes this way and an angle that goes up to the other corner. One thing to note is that on this one, you are cutting up to the top corner of this piece over here. And so you want to make sure that you cut that top strip accurately to the length that's listed in the pattern, because if your strip is too long or too short, that's going to throw off that whole angle, which is of course the angle that section B is going to attach to, and therefore your whole quilt can be off if that strip is not the exact right length. So if you aren't sure if you cut accurately, just go ahead and double check it now. If you're a little long, you can obviously just trim it off real quick, trim it off of that side. And if you're a little bit short, you could always add a piece if you need to. So we're gonna start with trimming this shorter side. I'm gonna turn it this way. And I have a nice big cutting mat, like I suggest in the pattern. I do all the trimmings for this one on the floor. I have a pretty big cutting table, but it's really not big enough to accommodate all of it, particularly once you get to trimming the other sections. This one's more doable. And so I find it's easier to just set it down on the floor, big cutting mat, and go to town. So this side, you are measuring the halfway point of this long section, which is 8 inches. So this is 16 inches across total, and you want to mark that middle point at 8 inches. You can just use a pen or a little removable marker. I like to use friction pins. I know they can be a little controversial, but I've never had problems with them, so to each his own. And then you want to lay out your ruler. You're going to need, unless you have a crazy long one, you're going to need more than one. You're going to lay out your ruler so that it hits this top point where these seams meet, the seams between the second and third strips. Okay, so we're going to adjust that. And goes down to where you just made your little mark at 8 inches. And then you'll just need to kind of wiggle your rulers around until you can get those to line up in a straight line. You'll have about roughly a 1/4 to 1/2 inch at the ends of these seams. You've got plenty of room to trim there. And once you've got it all lined up, if you want to mark it with a pin just so you have the line and make sure you don't mess it up, you can. Or if you're feeling more confident, you can go ahead and just straight up trim it. Away. So now you've got a nice line on this side. All right, and this other side is a little bit longer, so we're going to lay it out. This one's not going to fit, unless you have a really giant mat, not going to fit on all of your mat at once. Neither will your other sections when we get to trimming those. So that'll be something where you'll trim part of it, move your mat down, and finish trimming. So what we're doing again, and this one's probably going to take, depending on the size of your rulers, might take 3 or so rulers. You're going from this very top point of your fabric up here, all the way down to that 8 inch mark again where you made before, which is now, of course, its own point that you just created with your other cut. So we'll get those all lined up. And this, it's can be a little tricky to eyeball, of course, so you just kind of start laying down your rulers and then adjust as you see, well, like, oh, I'm really off here, or whatever the case is, until you can get them to line up in a straight line. more, you know, kind of long rulers you have, the better. So you can cover a good distance of the quilt at one time without having to, you know, piece together a whole bunch of little rulers by yourself. So we're good to go down at that point. Up to this point, everything's nice and flat. This side, you again have plenty of room to trim, so there's a good amount of wiggle room. Make sure everything's good. And then again, if you feel more comfortable, you can mark the line first, and then, you know, take your ruler away and just cut with one ruler at a time, or you can just go ahead with the way you've got it. So I'm actually going to start down here, or up here at the top. And of course we just took our ruler away, which is fine because now we can just use the, you know, portion we've already cut to make sure we know we have the right angle there. And keep going. And there you go. So now section A is all trimmed up, okay? And it's kind of a weird shape, you know, you've got a flat side over here and then it goes to a point over there, but that's part of the asymmetrical design of the quilt, so that is all correct. So now we're going to go grab section B and get it attached to section A. So if you want to, you know, lay it out on your floor so you have a sense of what you're doing here. We'll attach these, you know, before we trim them. But so section B goes like this. Okay, yeah, you can see that okay. So the longest background strip on section B is what is running alongside this left side of section A, like this. And you're going to offset it by an inch up here. So section B extends an inch past this point on section A. So you're going to get that all lined up, which I'll do in just a second. And then you'll flip section B over, make sure that 1 inch is there, pin all along this edge, and sew it, and then we'll get it all trimmed up. Pressed section B, attached it to section A. So this is section B down here, this is section A. The quilt's getting kind of big at this point, so it's a little trickier to get it all on screen at one time. But I've gone ahead and laid out my quilting rulers along this angle that's shown in the pattern. So what I like to do is take my my longest ruler and lay it out across most of this right angle on section A, so I know that I'm really basing the rest of my cutting off of this angle that we just trimmed in the last step. And then I just add on rulers. At this point, I think there are 5 there, until I get a line that stretches all the way down to the very bottom of section B, which unfortunately you can't see right this second. Let's see. There you go, all the way down at the end. And don't worry too much about kind of where it falls on the bottom. As long as you've got your top angle right from section A, you should be good to go for the rest of the way. If you don't have this many quilting rulers, you can certainly, you know, put 1 or 2 down, mark your line, move them down a little bit, mark your line again. You can also, as I mentioned in the pattern, use a really long tape measure. 120-inch tape measure will cover this distance. Obviously, it's not stiff like a quilting ruler, so you're going to want to use it in combination with a quilting ruler. If you kind of lay the quilting ruler out to give you a nice straight edge, and then you can pull the tape measure taut along the rest of the way until you've got what looks like a good edge, and then you can double check it with the quilting ruler. With this one, I find it's easiest to lay the whole thing out flat on the floor, get my rulers in place, and then I'll go ahead and mark this with my friction pin, so then I can take away all of the extra rulers, slide my mat underneath it, and go ahead and trim at that point, instead of trying to trim all at once, or you know, move a bunch of rulers around while I'm also moving the mat. So So we're just gonna mark our line all the way down. Okay, and then we can take all these away. Slide our mat under again, unless you have a really gigantic mat, not everything is gonna fit onto it at one time. So you're just gonna go ahead and take your longest ruler that you have and line it up with your line that you just drew. Okay. Go ahead and cut what will fit on the mat. And then you can either slide the ruler or slide the mat. Sometimes slide the quilt top or the mat. Sometimes the mat is a little easier to slide. Finish off this last part. And you'll get your workout in for the day. Hopefully you don't have bad knees. All right, so now we've got the biggest part of the quilt assembled. So I'll scooch this around a little bit so you can see it. Just handle it, you know, gently. You don't want to stretch that cut edge out too much. Okay. And then you've got section C, which you've already pieced. And it's going to go, you know, like this with the longest background strip up against that edge that you just cut. So it's going to go like this. Okay, except it's going to go down further. Sorry. This top edge where it's meeting section A, section C will be offset by 1/4 inch, which is, you know, such a small amount really, you can just eyeball it. So it'll extend 1/4 inch beyond section A. So once, you know, you can kind of lay it out for visual purposes, flip it over so they're right sides together. It'll be, like I said, 1/4 inch past. Just pin the whole length and then sew it together. And then we'll trim up the final quilt and you'll be all done. On to trimming the final quilt. Very exciting, we're all the way to the end. But this is probably also the part where you're gonna be most nervous about messing up because of course you have an almost finished quilt. You don't wanna do anything to destroy it at this point, but I will show you it was actually quite easy, probably easier than trimming even section B. So there's nothing for you to be concerned about. So we're gonna start on the right-hand side of the quilt because we have this straight edge up at the top of section A to be our guide. And so that's what we're gonna use to trim up all of the right section. So I've got, again, quilt down on the floor, mat underneath. I'm gonna use my long quilting ruler to guide myself along that straight edge the whole way. So I've got, you know, as much of a guide as I can. And then I'm just gonna, you know, this one's pretty straightforward. There's really no reason to line it up along the whole side. So if you start at the top, we're gonna trim this top part, move the mat down, move the ruler, and keep going until we get all the way to the bottom. Loose threads up there. Again, I do highly suggest that you give the quilt a really good press before you do any of the trimming stages. It'll just make sure that your quilt's lying, you know, as flat as possible, and you can get some really good cuts. When I'm doing this, I like to always make sure that I overlap the ruler on the part I just sewed a good amount. Like here I've got 13 inches overlapped on, not on the part I sewed, the part I cut. I've got 13 or so inches overlapping the part that I've cut, because if you just start at the bottom and try to just, you know, use that little bit for your guide, you could very easily, you know, be lined up there, but have your ruler start getting crooked. Whereas if you use a good amount of that straight edge, you can make sure that you're continuing the straight edge and not starting to get, you know, bowed out or bowed in one way or the other. Which means, of course, you have to move the ruler and cut smaller sections instead of, you know, just getting it done in 3 swipes or something. But it's going to mean that you have a straighter edge and therefore a more attractive quilt when you're done. Okay, so the right edge is all trimmed up now. So the next thing is we're going to take our quilt and we're going to fold it in half, right sides together. Okay, so I've taken my trimmed right side, folded over so that it's going to be, you know, face down, right sides together with the left side. And now you're going to have to do some straightening out. What you're going to do is you have this top straight edge of your quilt. Remember, this is a straight edge up here. You're going to use this straight edge to line up the 2 sides so you know that you're all even. Okay. And then you're going to, you know, work on flattening out your quilt top until you can get the right side over as far as possible without losing your tip. So of course you've got these, you know, where the different strips meet, you've got your little point there. Obviously you don't want the right side to extend past that, because if you do, when you cut it, you're going to cut out here and you're going to have this little notch, which is obviously not what you want. So you want to keep it inside these seams, but over as far as you can so that your quilt is as wide as possible. There's no reason to trim off extra fabric if you don't need to. You might as well keep all of your beautiful sewing. And so this can take a little bit of time to just make sure that everything is as flat as possible and as lined up as possible. Take your time, because again, if you take your time straightening, you will have a more attractive quilt in the end. Okay, so I've got the quilt top all nice and smooth and flat. Right side folded over to make a straight edge to trim the left side. I've rotated it, sorry if this confuses you, but I didn't want to block the camera. So this is the top of the quilt. This is the, you know, the left side now that we're about to trim. So right side, of course, has already been trimmed, so that's going to be our straight edge that we're using to guide our trimming. So we're just going to line up our ruler along the edge and cut. While we're up here, we'll trim off this little bit at the top of section B as well. Okay. Oops, slide the whole thing up. All right, so now our left side is all trimmed up and beautiful. So all we need to do now is finish up the bottom, rotate our mat again, keep the quilt just like it is, so it's nice and flat and straight. And this time, it's helpful to use the markings on your mat, particularly if you have a nice large mat, so you can line up the straight edge there. And so again, you're going to trim as low down as you can without, you know, cutting past these seam intersections. So in that case, it's going to be about there for me. and yours, you know, I say in a pattern that you'll trim it to the approximate finishing size, but depending on how accurate your piecing was or how accurate your trimming was, you know, the quilt size may vary slightly by an inch or two, which is why I don't tell you to, you know, trim to exactly 54 inches or whatever. Just base it off of where your seams are and you'll be fine. Just get my ruler all straightened up. Alright, now your bottom is all trimmed. You can double check, make sure you've got all your seams at the bottom. Sometimes you might think you've gotten low enough or high enough and you still have a few notches there you have to clean up. And now you've got a beautiful finished quilt. I really hope you enjoyed making this one. And if you have any questions, of course, don't hesitate to email, leave a note in the comments, or contact me on Instagram. Most of the video is about the throw quilt, but I thought I'd go ahead and show the baby quilt. For those of you who are making it, it is much less intimidating to trim, but it's always good to have a few examples too. It's nice because at least section A fits fully on your cutting mat. If you have a large one like I do, this is a 34-inch by 22-inch cutting mat. I'll link to it in the description below. But so that makes it a little easier not having to move your mat around quite as much. But it's the same basic process as with the throw. So we'll just run through it really quickly. So on this one, this is section A, of course, have marked the midpoint of this bottom section or color 3 strip. This is 10 inches wide, so the midpoint is at 5 inches. So we're gonna make one cut that goes from this midpoint to the top of this third strip here, and one that goes all the way to the corner up here. As I said in the throw, and I do suggest if you kind of watch through the baby and you're like, oh, I want some more explanation or some more tips or whatever, go ahead and watch through the throw version of it as well, because like I said, the baby one we'll go through a little bit quicker. But just to reiterate, it's really important that this top strip be cut accurately to the size that's listed in the pattern. Because you are trimming exactly to that corner and not to some other measurement, if that strip is longer or shorter than it's supposed to be, then that whole angle is going to be off, which affects the piecing of the other sections for the rest of the quilt. So if you aren't confident in your cutting, go ahead and double check that before you start to trim. If it's a little too short, you can always add a piece on, and if it's a little bit too long, then just make sure you trim it to size before you then trim this whole section. So I'm going to rotate my mat just a little bit. We're going to do this shorter side first. If you have a long 24-inch ruler like this one, you can easily stretch it in one go, so there's no stacking of rulers like you have to do for the throw. So again, it's to this top point in the third strip down to this midpoint that you just marked, and one easy cut. Okay, so that was all good. Now we'll rotate again. So this time, again, you're going to go from the center point up to the very tip of this top strip. This one, you can use the lines on your mat to help you line it up, since your ruler won't stretch across this whole span at once, but you can use the lines to help make sure you've got it straight. Actually, we're going to go turn it this way so we can get, so we'll line, I'm on the 14-inch mark on my mat, so I can make sure that this point is at the 14-inch and my point up here is at the 14-inch, and then I can use my ruler to line up along that line. Yeah, okay, just go back a little bit. ruler to line up on the 14 inch. Obviously you can pick whichever marker you want. 14 inch just happens to be the one I'm on. All right, so that whole section is trimmed. So now we're gonna sew on section B. So section B, A goes like this. Section B is gonna attach on this side, on the left side. It's gonna go like this, with the longest background strip up at the top, attaching to the left side of section A. You're gonna offset it by 1 inch. So section B will be 1 inch outside of this section A point when you go to piece it. So you'll flip them right sides together, make sure that's 1 inch away, and then pin down the whole side and sew it together. And then we'll come back and trim. This is sections A and B pieced together already, laid out on the mat. And just like the throw, this one, you can actually fit all the way on your cutting mat again if you have a large one, but you're still gonna need several rulers to lay out, make sure you've got your line nice and straight. This one I've got kind of 2.5 rulers to make it all line up. Use your longest ruler to use the top part of section A up here that's already been trimmed as your straight line guide. You want to overlap that by quite a bit to make sure you've got a really straight line and you're using the same angle. And then extend it down into section B and keep going, stacking your rulers until you get all the way to the bottom. Because again, this is a bigger piece with several rulers, I like to go ahead and just, once I have my rulers down, mark a line with my friction pin, and then I'll take, which I've already done, I'll take the rulers away, and then just use that marked line to go ahead and then trim. Okay, so now we've got a nice straight line there. So all we have left to do is go ahead and we'll lay section C down now. So let's see. So section C goes in this other corner. Again, longest background strip is what goes at the top. And you're gonna offset this top corner. So it's the point where the right side of section A and the top of section C meet. You're gonna offset section C by 1/4 inch. So, it's relatively small, you can just kind of eyeball it. And so then you're gonna flop it over. So they'll be right sides together, offset section C, 1/4 inch. So it's extending past section A by 1/4 inch. And then you will pin all the way down the side, sew it together, press towards section C, and then we will trim up the final quilt. I've got the baby quilt all sewn together, and all we have to do is trim it up to get our beautiful finished quilt. So again, we're back down on the floor. We're gonna trim up the right side first, because we've got this straight edge up at the top of section A that we're gonna use as our guide to trim up this whole side. So you're gonna use your long ruler, get it all even up on that side. Trim it up. Okay. And slide your mat down. Quilt, whatever works. There we go. To trim up the butt. That's good. Use this trimmed right side as the basis for trimming up the left side. What I'm gonna do is fold the quilt in half, right sides together. Okay. We've got the straight edge up at the top to use as our guide for making sure that that's all square. And then you're gonna, not stretch, but you're gonna fold the quilt over as far as you can until you basically meet the intersections of the seams. So of course you don't want it to go past those intersections, like down here. Right now it's going past that intersection. You don't want it to go past that, because if you do, you'll have a little, you know, notch in your side. So you want to kind of keep adjusting it until you're inside all of those seams. And flatten it out nice and flat. Just like that. Get it back onto your mat. And we're going to trim. We're going to use this right side as our guide for trimming. We'll trim off this top little piece first with using the top of the quilt, and then we'll trim right down the left side. Trim off some of the loose threads up there. Okay. So, pause the video because I'm going to be in your way here in a second, but we're just going to, like I said, use this clean right side to trim off the left side all the way down. We'll move the mat as we go until we get to the bottom. And for our last cut, we just need to trim off the bottom. It's treated the same way as the left side was, where you want to put your ruler down as low as you can while not cutting below these seam intersections, because again, you want a nice straight edge, no notches. So you can use your mat to give yourself a nice straight line. Lay your quilt out so that the side you just trimmed is even with one of the longer lines, and then you can use your ruler to align the other way and give yourself a nice straight edge for one cut. All right, double check we didn't miss any. Oh, see, we did miss a notch, so we're gonna cut a little bit higher. Not a problem. Double check that we're gonna be above that notch. There we go. Yep, okay. All right, we can open it all up. And we've got a lovely finished quilt top. Again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to, leave a comment, or you can email me. The email is on the website, blueskymoderncraft.com, or you can find me on Instagram at blueskycrafter. Thanks so much.